The fact that it's now a persistent feature of commodity trading, is that something that needs to be embedded into contracts?
If you just look at the last 6 years and the things that we've had that have impacted global trade, I don't think that uncertainty is going to go away anytime soon. I think it's very difficult to look at your contract and try to draft something that is going to deal with every eventuality.
This is Trade Finance Talks, your go-to podcast on cross-border trade, brought to you by Trade Finance Global.
Hello and welcome to Trade Finance Talks. I'm Mahika Ravishankar, Deputy Editor at Trade Finance Global. And today we're going to be talking about what have come to be described as maritime battlefields in commodity trading. Constant drone attacks in the Black Sea, targeting key Russian energy infrastructure, have echoes of recent developments in the Strait of Hormuz. This all makes for compelling headlines, but how it translates to contract law for commodity traders and the buyers and suppliers themselves is a far more intricate question. I'm joined by Adam Richardson, partner at law firm HFW, to go over how similar or dissimilar these two naval flashpoints are, and whether other supply chain shocks, like the COVID-19 pandemic, have taught any transferable lessons. Adam, welcome to Trade Finance Talks.
Thank you very much for having me.
So could we start with some quick introductions? Can you please introduce yourself and tell us about your role at HFW?
Absolutely. So my name is Adam Richardson. I'm a partner at HFW, an international law firm. I'm a partner in the commodities team based in the Singapore office, and I'm the head of the Singapore office as well. So most of the work that I do relates to physical commodities and trade finance. So the issues that you mentioned at the outset are ones that we've been seeing a lot of recently.
Thanks. And to dive right in, it's now been 5 months since conflict in the Middle East began, which has led to pretty persistent disruptions and the effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz. How would you describe the current state of events of disruption for commodity traders operating in the region?
I think the first thing I would say is that if you asked anyone when this all started whether they thought we'd still be talking about it now, I think they'd probably say no. I think even the most bearish person didn't imagine back in February, March that we'd still be in the situation that we're in. And of course, there've been lumps and bumps along the way. And I think the key word amongst all of this is uncertainty. There have been times where it looks like matters are about to resolve themselves, and then times where it's got worse again. And we're still seeing those kind of ebbs and flows many months after everything started. Now, in terms of the impact on the traders and on shipping, obviously traders are quite a pragmatic bunch. I mean, I was following the headlines about what they were doing when this all broke out, quite aside from the legal points. And it was interesting to see that in the first few weeks, we had headlines around traders worrying about profits and how they were going to navigate all of this uncertainty. And just a few weeks later, we're seeing headlines about how the traders are making record amounts of money. So, they're very pragmatic.
Yeah, I saw just a few hours ago, Shell disclosing record profits.
Absolutely. And particularly those involved in the paper markets, where they're not quite so concerned with the on-the-ground operational difficulties that you have in the physical markets. The people that feed off the volatility have made a huge amount of money throughout this period. I mean, we saw the Brent prices in excess of $100 in April and May. We saw that as recently as last week, which really goes back to the point I made earlier about how we're seeing these peaks and troughs of the issues and how they impact pricing. Now, that's from the trading perspective. Obviously, from an operational perspective, it has been incredibly challenging. We've had vessels which are stuck in the strait, one side or the other. We've had vessels unable to transit the strait, and you hear these very concerning stories about seafarers who are effectively stranded and supplies are limited, etc., etc. So there's a real concerning human element to all of this as well. And on an operational level, it's incredibly challenging to navigate, and obviously from a legal perspective as well. So I think whilst the traders are doing well out of this on the whole, I think the operational and legal teams in those trading companies have had a very difficult time of it.
And how have those operational and legal teams responded to the new uncertain and challenging environment? What are some key contractual issues that they've had to work through?
So I think the big one that has come out, and then the obvious one really, is force majeure. I mean, those are the clauses which deal with these sorts of extraneous events that are no fault based. They're not attempting to allocate liability onto any party. They are to deal with situations which arise that the parties have not necessarily legislated for. And the idea generally behind them is that they will excuse parties from performing where you have these extraneous events. And that is the big topic that's come up from a legal perspective over the last few months. We've also had a lot of issues around termination of contract. If a party has failed to present a vessel in time, or if a party has failed to load a cargo on time, whether that gives rise to a right to terminate and to damages. But the big one really has been force majeure. Now, in terms of how people navigate that, we've seen a wide variety of different approaches. We are often asked in abstract terms, with all of these difficulties, is it a case that contracts are excused on the basis of force majeure? And unfortunately, the answer is it depends. I know that's a bit of a lawyerly argument, but a lawyerly thing to say, but that is the truth of the matter. I mean, there are a lot of considerations that go into these assessments. It's a question of what the product is under the contract. It's a question of what the origin of that product is, and if there's some sort of optionality as to the origin, whether that's been locked in or whether that's still open. It's questions around what the delivery terms are. It can be very different depending if you're trading on an FOB or a CFR, CIF basis. All of these things do make quite a big difference to that assessment. And quite apart from that, there is the factual question, which is to what extent have the events actually affected performance? And again, going back to the point I made earlier, that is something which is changing constantly. There have been times during this period where it has been a bit easier and times when it has been a little bit harder. So a lot of things which go into that broad question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lawyer's answer and also a politician's answer, I guess, either here or there.
I'm afraid so.
And I guess you can't really speak to which specific responses work better than others. But in general, is there a kind of attitude towards navigating this contractual difficulty that you might recommend that you've found easier to work with than a different attitude?
Yes, I think so. I think there are kind of operational, organizational approaches to the issues which make things easier and are ultimately likely to result in better outcomes for those companies. So the approaches that we have seen working well, and again, it may not surprise you to hear this coming from a lawyer, are the more methodical, the more structured approaches. We have seen a lot of companies who have really got ahead of the issue that they know is coming. They've got a very clear view of the contracts which may be affected by this. And they've made sure they got their arms around the problem early. They're identifying contracts, they're identifying products and destinations which are likely to be affected, and at an early stage, working out which contracts are already affected, which ones are coming up that are likely to be affected. And so they're really just staying ahead of the game. And what they're also doing is they are consistently monitoring what is happening from a factual and operational perspective. So, for example, they may be in touch with their brokers to work out which vessels are where and what the availability of vessels is. What's the latest news around vessels being struck, because that has obviously been a problem as well, vessels actually being struck. And so that very methodical approach has worked very well. And the way you see that manifesting is that they have a very clear view on the notices that they're going to need to send, what they contain, et cetera, to make sure that they are complying with what they need to comply with under the contract. I think the other side of the coin is the slightly more, I may call it a laissez-faire approach to this, which is to say, well, there's all this disruption in the Middle East, and therefore it's force majeure, and I'm just going to send out bland notices to everyone without really doing the digging and hard work to work out whether the contract is actually affected. We have seen this kind of scattergun approach where people are sending out generic messages which don't grapple with actually how performance of a particular contract is affected. They're just saying, well, the Middle East has occurred, it's a terrible situation, and therefore we don't need to perform. And I think the difficulty with that approach, whilst it may help you in the short term, is that, if those notices end up getting challenged, you may end up with quite significant claims and termination of contract and all of those consequences. So as I say, the companies that have taken a more methodical and structured approach to this, identified issues early, come up with a way of dealing with the issue in a methodical way, those are the ones who I think in the long term are going to be better placed.
I guess these are all lessons learnt from a few months of disruption in the Middle East, but in the last month or so, the Black Sea has been making headlines for similar reasons, with vessels and ports being struck. Just today, actually, Ukraine struck a Russian grain port in the Black Sea. What impact is this disruption having on global commodity flows?
It's a very good question. I mean, obviously, the Black Sea issues have been going on for somewhat longer. I mean, I can't believe when I think about it sometimes quite how long that has been going on, but we have seen a spike in the hostilities just in the last few weeks. And as you mentioned, there have been drone strikes, both on infrastructure and on vessels as well. And so we're seeing an impact on two main types of commodities. The first, again, is oil, similar to the Middle East, which is the biggest victim of the Strait of Hormuz, if you like. So we've seen disruption in the oil markets, but also soft commodities, because, of course, a lot of agricultural commodities are coming out of the Black Sea, and we've seen impact on pricing, for example, on wheat futures already being impacted by that. Again, I think one of the big challenges in all of this is finding out accurate information as to what is really going on. And I think there's two aspects to that. The first is that there are a wide variety of sources of news and figures which are not always aligned in terms of, the number of vessels which are loading, the number of vessels which have been hit, etc., etc. Earlier today, I'd heard a report that there are 2 vessels in the Black Sea which have been struck. And, it's moving so quickly, and all of this is impacting operations. It's impacting how the legal teams are looking at it, because when something like that happens, it's obviously increased risk, safety issues, feeds into your analysis of the whole situation and whether you are able to perform contracts.
And how does this disruption differ from the situation in the Middle East at all? Are the contractual issues which you just outlined the same, or what are some key differences?
I think at a very basic level, the contractual issues are relatively similar. I mean, we are really in force majeure territory, and we have over the last couple of weeks started to see parties issuing, or at least considering issuing, force majeure notices in respect of the issues in the Black Sea. At a very kind of high level view, the law on force majeure is well established. It's not product specific. So those issues are similar in many ways. There are differences in the contracts which are typically used in those industries. And so that, again, impacts the analysis. But I think at a very basic level, the issues are similar.
And has the force majeure clause largely been effective in the Black Sea context?
I think that's yet to be seen, because it is much more of a live issue. I think one of the big issues that's worth talking about briefly is, I mentioned that out of the Black Sea, we've seen the oil markets affected, we've seen soft commodities affected. And I do think that the force majeure regimes for typical contracts in those industries can be quite different. You have the oil trading terms, which are generally quite sophisticated, long form, have a very comprehensive force majeure regime. And for soft commodities, a lot of the published industry terms are actually contain, for example, a unilateral right to declare force majeure. So you may find that actually the seller is the only party who can declare force majeure, and the buyer may just be left in a very difficult position. Now, you can obviously amend that by contract, but that is the default position under a lot of these terms. So the buyers for soft commodities can find themselves in very difficult situations.
So for contracts that are being prepared now, is the disruption that's occurred since 2026 changed the way that buyers and sellers prepare commodity trade contracts in the first instance?
I think we're starting to see that now. I mean, I think in the first few months of these things, it's really emergency response mode. It's about getting around the problem. It's about making sure the notices have gone out, or if you're receiving notices, making sure you're responding to them. It's only after you get a little bit of downtime that you can really think about the future and what it means for your future contracts, because it's very hard during that initial stage to do anything other than just try and keep your head above water, to be perfectly honest. So I do think we're in that phase now where companies are starting to think about what they might do differently in the future. We have been asked to advise trading companies on what changes they would make to their contracts. And that's to the force majeure clauses. It could also be to clauses, for example, which define what the parties' obligations are, because as I mentioned earlier, one of the ingredients is that you need to show that you've been prevented from performing your obligations. And if you have vaguely defined obligations, it can actually be quite difficult to prove exactly what you're not able to do. I mean, everyone knows there's massive disruption, but finding that causal link can be quite difficult. So these things manifest themselves in slightly different ways, but certainly we are seeing a phase now where traders are using these lessons to trade their contracts. And this is nothing new, really. I mean, you get these events which are lessons learned and go into contracts, and you watch the contracts evolve over time. I don't think you're ever going to be in a position where you're going to have a perfect contract that legislates for everything, because, when COVID came along, we had the same thing, right? And I don't think many people saw that coming. And so after COVID, we had a change to force majeure clauses. We then had the Russia-Ukraine situation, and we saw people looking at their sanctions clauses and some of their other clauses, and now we've got this again, and people are looking at their clauses again. So for me, the best contracts are the ones that are clear about what they do and don't do. Don't try to legislate for absolutely everything, because I think it's impossible, but what they should have really is the benefit of all the experience of these things that have come before, and it's just a matter of constantly tweaking and updating.
And these big changes to supply chains, you mentioned COVID, you mentioned Russia, Ukraine, and sanctions on Russia. Did they result in permanent shifts in how commodity trade contracts are prepared? Or was it more spur of the moment, and then recently people have sort of sprung back to how they were before? And on that note, do you think that redefining who would benefit from a force majeure clause and any other changes to contracts that have happened as a result of conflict in the Middle East this year, do you think those contractual changes are going to be lasting or not?
I think they will be lasting, yes. I mean, what we tend to find is that once changes are made to contracts, they stay there. And as I say, I think people will continue to look at and refine their processes. In the short term, another thing that we do see is in a force majeure clause, people may actually add some sort of acknowledgement of what is actually going on. So you may have an express acknowledgement of the disruption in the Middle East or the disruption in the Black Sea. The reason parties do that is because when you get into arguments about force majeure, you often have arguments around foreseeability. So, for example, if you were to enter into a contract today for deliveries in the Black Sea, and then you turn around a week later and say, well, actually, I can't do it because of all this disruption, the other party may well say, well, we knew about that a week ago, and you signed this contract a week ago, and so you can't tell me now, a week later, that you can't do it. In the short term, we do have those kind of tweaks which acknowledge the current situation. I mean, if you read a force majeure clause in most commodities trading contracts today, it will still say COVID-19. It will still expressly acknowledge that COVID-19 is a thing. It's not something that we feel on a day-to-day basis on the same way that it once was. But the reason that came about is because parties wanted to say, well, it exists. And if I enter into a contract now and a week later I can't deliver because of COVID, or I can't take delivery because of COVID, we've at least acknowledged that COVID will be something that we can rely on. So we're seeing that as well.
So would it say something like COVID-19 and any other global pandemics which might occur?
Exactly right, yeah. So it would say normally epidemics, pandemics, brackets, including COVID-19 or something like that. And we are, as I say, we are starting to see, for example, in soft commodities contracts, an acknowledgement of what's happening in the Black Sea and saying, well, actually, if that does affect performance, we're still going to be relying on it. The other thing I would mention at a kind of organizational level, aside from the contracts, is that we are seeing parties revisit and develop their emergency response processes. So these things are going to happen from time to time. We spoke about COVID and some of the similarities to the situation we see now. And as I say, the legal issues and the way you need to respond is actually similar in many ways. There are, of course, a lot of nuances and factual specifics. But we have been asked previously, for example, to help clients develop a force majeure response plan. So if something happens, how do you go about identifying the contracts? What are the first 3 things you need to do if you're giving a notice? What are the things you need to do if you're receiving a notice? I think that can be very helpful at the early stages. As I mentioned earlier, I think that kind of structured approach to responding is going to serve parties well in the long term. It's actually quite interesting. I had a meeting with a client yesterday, and we had prepared something like this for them during COVID. And they said it's great because we got this out when all the stuff in the Middle East started and we can still use it. So
Really?
It's quite satisfying to hear that something kind of 6 years later is something that people still refer back to. So there is value in front running it. I mean, a lot of the time people don't want to think about these things until they have to think about them. And that's why you get these sorts of things being developed off the back of COVID. But it shows you the value of doing it when it comes back 6 years later in a different form.
Mm-hmm. The fact that it's now a persistent feature of commodity trading, is that something that needs to be embedded into contracts? And in a more broad sense, where, like you say, you can get the same contract that will cover you in the case of a global pandemic or geopolitical conflict?
I think parties just need to be ready for the unexpected. I mean, if you just look at the last 6 years and the things that we've had that have impacted global trade, they're massive events, right? COVID, Russia, Ukraine, now the Middle East and the Black Sea. And I don't think that uncertainty is going to go away anytime soon. So parties do need to be prepared for it. As I mentioned earlier, I think it's very difficult to look at your contract and try to draft something that is going to deal with every eventuality because we simply don't know what it's going to be.
I was going to ask, like, what does a perfect contract look like then?
I wish I could tell you. I haven't seen one yet. I think a good commodity trading contract, as I say, is one is very clear about what it does and is one that is kept well up to date based on lessons learned. I think it is very challenging to anticipate everything that's going to happen. But as I say, if you made good changes to your contracts based on COVID, you'd probably be well placed for what we're seeing now.
Okay. Thanks, Adam. Clear and up-to-date contracts. I feel like that's the lesson to go away with if you're writing a commodity trade contract right now. Adam, thanks a lot for joining us today and for coming in.
Thank you very much for having me.